In the middle of the 18th century, on a small island located in the heart of the Indian Ocean, one of the most tragic stories ever took place. A story of survival and suffering of enslaved people who were illegally taken from their lands and forced against their will to face an unexpected fate after the ship they were kidnapped on board of crashed. The result was a group of helpless people being stranded on a deserted island in the middle of the ocean, where they struggled for 15 full years in an attempt to stay alive. With no hope of rescue, they relied on their determination and abilities, leaving behind a mark on the island that the world still talks about to this day. Welcome, everyone. Today, we are going to tell you the story of the forgotten slaves on the island of Sand. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you can receive alerts for a new story every week. And we want you to get this video to 20,000 likes before the next video as a motivation for us to continue. On one night in July 1761, the French sailor Jean de Lafargue set sail aboard the ship L'Utile, which belonged to the French East India Company, on a journey from the island of Mauritius, which at that time was called L'Île de France, heading toward the island of Madagascar in Africa. He was accompanied by 140 members of the ship's crew. Their mission was to transport some goods from one island to another. The plan was for him to sail the ship, deliver the cargo, collect the money, and return back to France. The journey usually took only a few days. However, despite the fact that the goods Jean was assigned to transport were very valuable and that the profit he would make from the trip was already significant, when he arrived in Madagascar, he felt that he could make another secret deal that would bring him much bigger profits than the original journey. His evil idea led him to take a group of enslaved men, women, and children and sell them on the island of Rodrigues during his return trip to France. No one would know, and no one would find out. Although the slave trade was very widespread during that period, at that specific time, the ruler of France had imposed a ban on slave trading because France was involved in a war against Britain known as the 7 Years' War. Jean knew very well that what he was doing was illegal. However, he continued with his deal anyway. He bought 160 people from Madagascar, men, women, and children, and placed them all inside the narrow cargo hold at the bottom of the ship, locking them there and leaving them with only a few small ventilation openings that barely allowed some oxygen to enter, a move that showed he was completely stripped of humanity. On the night of July 31, 1761, Jean decided to sail the ship in the middle of the night so he could complete his deal and return to France without anyone noticing that he had taken longer than expected. Only a few hours after leaving, a powerful storm hit, with winds exceeding 37 kilometers per hour, turning the calm sea into massive waves. Because of the height of the waves, Jean could no longer see the route clearly, so he had to rely on the maps he had with him. But the problem was that when he opened the two maps he had on board, he found that the location of Rodrigues Island on the first map was completely different from its location on the second map. In this situation, he was supposed to wait until sunrise so he could determine the correct route. But because he was in a hurry and afraid that his secret deal would be exposed, he decided to take a risk and choose one of the two directions randomly. Unfortunately, for the poor people trapped on the ship, the direction he chose was the wrong one. After a short while, he was suddenly surprised when his crew members came running toward him, telling him that the ship had struck something, causing damage to the rear part of the hull. Water started flooding everywhere, and the ship was only moments away from sinking with everyone on board. Because of the huge waves, Jean did not realize that the ship was approaching an isolated island in the middle of the ocean. But the problem at that moment was not the island itself. The real danger was the coral reefs and massive rocks surrounding it, which struck the bottom of the ship and caused major damage to several parts of it. Unfortunately, the damage happened on the side where the cargo hold containing the trapped enslaved people was located. Water began entering the hold, and panic and fear started spreading throughout the place. At that moment, Jean and his crew realized that the journey was over, and they had no hope left. They decided to abandon the ship and jumped into the water, swimming toward the island's shore. But because of the violent waves, 20 crew members were swept away from the shore and drowned. Meanwhile, the poor enslaved people continued fighting for their lives inside the sinking ship, trying to escape through the holes created by the rocks in the hull. However, because of the limited space and the lack of time, only 68 people out of the original 160 managed to escape the ship and reach safety. Unfortunately, it was not really a safe place. The island they reached was nothing more than a small piece of land with an area of no more than 200 acres. It was discovered by France in the 1720s, in the middle of the ocean. At first, it was a volcano, but over millions of years, erosion destroyed most of it, leaving only a small part above sea level. The highest point on the island was only 7 meters above sea level, meaning there was not even a high place where they could watch for approaching ships from a distance. But even that was not their biggest problem. The biggest problem was the lack of plants on the island. The entire surface was covered with sand, except for a few small grasses and short trees, and even those plants produced no fruits. That is why, when the island was first discovered, it was named the Island of Sand. Since an island in the middle of the sea that lacks plants would obviously have no animals, there were only a few fish living around the coral reef surrounding the island. But even catching those fish was extremely difficult because of the strong waves and the sharp rocks. The only positive thing was that some types of birds and turtles visited the island from time to time for reproduction, and this was their only chance to obtain any kind of food. The second problem they faced was that the island was located just south of the equator. This meant that the weather there was tropical and extremely hot, with high temperatures throughout most of the year. The only months when the temperature dropped slightly were July and August, when it became somewhat more bearable. Of course, on an island like this, with no trees and no places providing shade, the heat felt even more intense than normal. In addition, the island's small size, its location, and the fact that there was nothing protecting the people living there meant that even the days when the temperature was slightly pleasant were followed by storms that were almost deadly. Not only that, but during most summer days, the island was hit by violent storms accompanied by heavy thunderstorms and intense rainfall. Despite the harsh weather conditions, these storms were always their only opportunity to collect fresh water suitable for drinking. The difficult situation they were facing required cooperation and unity among everyone on the island so they could survive. But it also required a leader who could organize them and try to maintain the morale of the people there so that the situation would not become worse. However, what happened was that Jean, the captain of the ship, who became the leader of the island from the moment they arrived, started behaving strangely. He was always distracted, isolated, and refused to speak with anyone. All the signs showed that what happened had caused him a severe psychological shock, so the crew had no choice but to remove him from leadership and give control to the ship's first officer, Barthélemy Castellan du Vernet. But Barthélemy was no better than Jean when it came to racism or selfishness. On his first day as the leader of the island, he ordered the enslaved people to be separated from the rest of the ship's crew. Then he gave orders to everyone, both the crew members and the enslaved people, to collect anything from the ship that the water carried onto the island. He also asked everyone who knew how to swim to enter the ocean whenever the waves became calmer, so they could collect the wreckage and gather all the supplies that remained on the ship, including food and water. Although the enslaved people participated in these tasks, complete control over the food and water remained in Barthélemy's hands and the hands of his crew. They only gave the enslaved people small crumbs of food, and as for water, it was completely forbidden for them. This cruel and racist treatment caused 8 enslaved people to die during their first days on the island because of dehydration. After that, Barthélemy began thinking about digging a well on the island so that he and his crew could drink from it. When they started realizing that they might spend a long time on the island, they also built an oven to cook their food and a furnace to melt the metals they collected from the ocean. Little by little, they began creating a plan to escape this place and return to their homeland. Using all the wood they collected from the wreckage of the old ship, they did not build just a simple rescue boat. They built a huge ship and named it Providence. On September 27, 1761, Only 2 months after their arrival on the island, they finished building the new ship. Barthélemy boarded it along with Jean and the rest of the crew members to return to France. But when the enslaved people who had helped them build the ship came to board, they refused to let them join. Instead, they promised them that they would send help as soon as they safely reached France. After 4 days of sailing, the crew of the Providence finally reached L'Île de France, which is today known as Mauritius. However, during those 4 days, most of the crew members became sick, and many of them died either during the journey or shortly after arriving in Mauritius. Captain Jean was among those who died on the ship. With the death of the men responsible for the disaster that happened, there was no one left to hold accountable except Barthélemy. The governor of L'Île de France summoned him immediately after his arrival. But the governor was extremely angry when he learned about the story of the enslaved people. Not because Barthélemy and the others had abandoned them in the middle of the ocean and left them behind, but because Barthélemy had agreed with Jean from the beginning to make the slave deal, even though both of them knew that these transactions were forbidden at that time. After receiving a series of criticisms, punishments, and psychological pressure, Barthélemy's conscience finally began to wake up. He started trying to convince the governor of L'Île de France to send a ship to rescue the enslaved people who had been abandoned on the island, hoping to fix part of the disaster he had helped create. But despite his repeated requests, the governor refused. He told him that the country was going through a difficult period and that he had no intention of sacrificing one of his ships to help a group of enslaved people who had become lost because of a mistake made by leaders who only cared about their own interests. And once again, the ones who paid the price were the helpless people stranded on the island. In the months following the departure of the Providence from the island of Sand, the number of enslaved people had decreased to only 60. They still had hope that the French would keep their promise and send a ship to rescue them. But as 1 month passed after another, their hope began to disappear. They had no choice but to try to adapt to their situation and accept that this island was now their new home. With the absence of many natural resources, they were forced to dig deep holes in the sand and strengthen them with coral rocks so they could use them as shelters to protect themselves from the harsh weather conditions. One of the most tragic things was that, at that time, the people of Madagascar commonly buried their dead inside tombs that looked very similar to the shelters they built on the island. This meant that they were forced to live inside graves that were originally built for the dead. What makes the situation even more heartbreaking is that most of these people, before experiencing this suffering, had lived in the central highlands of Madagascar. This meant they were very far away from coastal areas, and therefore did not have skills such as fishing. Days and months passed, and the Malagasy people, the people of Madagascar, slowly began adapting to their new reality and solving their problems with water and food. But the problem was that their numbers continued to decrease constantly. No one knew why the people who were dying were dying. Was it because of disease? Was it because of malnutrition? Or was there another reason? But despite everything, they refused to give up. With determination and persistence, they began collecting any pieces of wood that washed up on the island's shore. They made nails from animal bones and melted metals, and used them to build a large raft so they could escape from the island. After they finished building it, 18 people climbed aboard and left the island, hoping they could reach another place and send people to rescue those who remained behind. But unfortunately, after the moment they disappeared from the sight of their companions in the middle of the ocean, they were never seen again. No one knows what happened to them. Months passed, and hope disappeared once again. They continued struggling on the island for months and years. After 3 years had passed, only 15 people remained on the entire island out of the 160 people who had originally left Madagascar. During this time, Barthélemy was still trying every possible way to convince the governor to send help or supplies to these poor people. And every time his requests were rejected, he tried to deliver his demands to any official in the country. Eventually, his efforts reached the Minister of Naval Affairs in L'Île de France, and he continued pressuring him throughout the years of war. In 1771, meaning 11 years after the sinking of the L'Île ship, Barthélemy finally succeeded in obtaining approval from the Minister of Naval Affairs to send help to the Malagasy people who were still on the island. Even he was no longer sure whether they were still alive or not. However, because this approval was obtained secretly, the procedures moved extremely slowly. Although Barthélemy did not remain silent and even involved the media in the matter to pressure public opinion against the government, by 1773 there was still no decision to send a rescue ship. They continued delaying the matter until 1775, when finally the first rescue ship departed and headed toward the island's location. After several days, the rescue crew reached a point close to the island. But as soon as they reached the outer edge of the island, they found it surrounded everywhere by rocks and coral reefs. They feared that the same thing that happened to the previous ship would happen to them. So they turned back and returned once again toward L'Île de France without taking anyone with them. When Barthélemy learned what had happened, he did not give up. He insisted that they try again. 1 year later, a new rescue ship was sent, but this time, it followed a different route from the previous ship. This time, they managed to get closer to the island. However, they still could not reach the island itself because they were afraid that the rocks would destroy the ship. So 2 members of the rescue crew got into a small boat so they could reach the island and transport the people there in several trips. But only a few minutes later, a powerful storm suddenly hit. Huge waves overturned the small boat among the coral reefs, breaking it into pieces. The 2 rescuers had no choice but to continue swimming. One of them decided to swim toward the rescue ship. The other decided to swim toward the island. Unfortunately, the man who swam toward the island and refused to give up was betrayed as well. As soon as he reached the shore, he watched with his own eyes as his companion sailed away with the ship and returned to their homeland, leaving him behind on the island with the remaining people. When the island survivors saw him, they took him to the shelters they had built. He was forced to live with them and experience the same suffering they had been enduring for years. But little by little, he encouraged them to build a new raft using the remaining pieces of wood still available on the island. However, this raft would be different from the previous one. This time, it would be equipped with a sail made from the feathers of seabirds that occasionally visited the island. Slowly, hope began to return to their hearts once again. After they finished building the new raft, several of the remaining people on the island climbed aboard and left. The rest stayed behind, waiting with hope that someone would eventually come to rescue them. But for the 3rd time, 1 month passed, then another, then another. The raft that left was never seen again. Their fate became the same as the fate of the previous attempts. The remaining group returned to their miserable lives on the island, hoping that one day they would finally escape this suffering. Until the day came, November 29, 1776. The moment they had been waiting for 15 years finally arrived. The French warship Dauphin reached the shore of the island under the command of Captain Jacques-Marie de Tromelin. As soon as he arrived, he was shocked by what he saw. When he left France, he knew that he was assigned to bring back more than 60 people. But all he found when he arrived, there were only 8 people in total. 7 women and a small baby who was only 8 months old. As for the remaining 60 people, they had all died. Tromelin took the 8 survivors aboard his ship and sailed with them. For the first time in 15 years, they were finally outside the island where they had been trapped. He headed with them toward L'Île de France. At that time, the political and economic situation was relatively stable, and the island had a new governor who had better morals than the previous one. When he received news of their arrival, he ordered to meet them personally. He discovered that the baby who was with them had his mother and grandmother still alive, and they were among the 8 people rescued. So he took them and decided that they would live with him inside his palace. He named the little child Jacques Mose, after Moses, in reference to the story of his rescue from the waters. As for the rest of the enslaved people, he declared their freedom. He announced to the public that they were never slaves by nature. They were free people who had originally been kidnapped from their lands. When he gave them the choice between staying on Mauritius or returning home, they completely refused to board any ship ever again. At that moment, The governor decided to give them houses to live in and granted them French citizenship as compensation for what had happened to them. After that, their story completely disappeared from historical records. No one knew anything about their new lives. As for the island of sand, it was renamed Tromelin Island, after the captain of the ship who rescued them. After that incident, Tromelin Island once again became an abandoned island in the middle of the ocean. No one paid attention to it again until many centuries later, when a researcher examined historical records and discovered this story through old documents and the writings of Barthélemy himself. Because of this discovery, an archaeological investigation was launched under the sponsorship of UNESCO as part of efforts to commemorate the struggle against slavery. 4 archaeological expeditions were carried out, beginning in 2006 and continuing until 2013. Because of these missions, Tromelin Island became an important archaeological site. Today, both France and Madagascar continue to dispute ownership of the island. And with that, we have reached the end of the story. Tell us your opinion in the comments. And if you have a story that you want us to tell, write it in the comments. The idea that receives the most interaction, I will make a video about it, God willing. Show me your support, subscribe, like, comment, and do all that good stuff. And share the video with anyone you think would enjoy it.